welcome, Dr. Jeff Tarrant. I'm super excited to have you join my podcast today and my YouTube videos. I have been reading all about you. I am a Forever Family medium, so this is actually how I heard about you. Dr. Jeff actually studies mediums, and we'll get into that in a moment. But before we do, let me read his bio, which is quite extensive, so forgive me if I stumble on some of the words. Dr. Tarrant is the founder and director of Psychic Mind Science and the Neuromeditation Institute in Eugene, Oregon. He's a licensed psychologist and board certified in neurofeedback. Dr. Tarrant specializes in teaching clinical applications and research combining technology-based interventions with meditative states for improved mental health. His research focuses on exploring brainwave changes that occur as a result of contemplative practices, technological interventions, non-ordinary states of consciousness, and psi-related abilities. Dr. Tarrant is the author of the books Meditation Interventions to Rewire the Brain and Becoming Psychic, Lessons from the Minds of Mediums, Healers, and Psychics. That's quite a bio. So where do we even begin? I was just reviewing, I read your second book, which is Becoming Psychic. I know it's not showing probably on the screen correctly, but that's what it is, Becoming Psychic. And I was instantly drawn in, and I didn't even realize you had a second book, which I will be purchasing after this interview.
Oh, well, thank you.
Oh, absolutely. I wanted to start a little bit where you started. I know that your interest was piqued by Janet Mayer, who is actually a medium also at the Forever Family Foundation. And I know it came by in a kind of an odd way with one of your students. But she is actually widely spoken about in the Forever Family Foundation as well because of her unique and extraordinary abilities. So rather than me explain those to the audience, I'll have you do that because I know this is where it started. Am I right about that? Sort of studying mediums?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Janet was, I jokingly blame Janet. It's Janet's fault that this is my life now, in a good way. I love Janet. She's great. And so, yeah, I met Janet, gosh, I keep losing track of time. I'm going to say, I don't know, 12 years ago or something like that. And yeah, I met her through her son, who was a student of mine at the University of Missouri at the time. And he, knew that I studied brains and said, "Hey, I want to introduce you to my mom." I'm cutting the story short, obviously, but and so started working with Janet, and you mentioned she has a unique ability. And so it's interesting that that's how I got started, was with somebody who it wasn't just a straight, I want to say traditional mediumship, if there is such a thing, right? But so Janet's kind of special ability that she has is, beyond being a medium, is she channels South American tribal languages. And this wasn't something, this is something that just kind of happened to her after a holotropic breathwork experience, which, if people aren't familiar, it's a kind of a rapid breathing practice that is used to induce non-ordinary states of consciousness. It can be pretty psychedelic, actually, when you do this practice. It's a very rapid breathing. The music is very loud and evocative. And, after 20 minutes of that, people are usually in some sort of a psychedelic state. Anyway, Janet was doing this with her sister, and all of a sudden, these languages just started coming through her. And she didn't even know if it was a language. At the beginning, she didn't know what was going on. It sounded like a language, and she figured it was a language, but she didn't know what she's saying. She still doesn't know what she's saying, which is kind of interesting that this information comes through, and she seems to get senses about it, about what it is and what it means, but she doesn't know what the words are. And so after years of this happening to her, after this opened up, after this ability opened, it kept happening, outside of the breath work. And, and so she started recording this, trying to understand what's going on. And finally, after, I think it was like 4 years, she found an anthropologist who was able to confirm that, in fact, these are languages. There was at least 4 different dialects of South American tribal languages that she's bringing through. And it's usually in the form of teachings and prayers and things of that nature. So, this is how I got started was, hey, Janet's got this interesting story, this interesting ability. Do you want to see what her brain's doing? And, I mean, how are you going to turn that down? Anybody in their right mind is going to do it. Although, to be honest, you hear the story, and from a science perspective, you're going, I don't know. Is this for real, or who is this person? And so it's funny because I think both of us were kind of checking each other out at the beginning. Her checking me out to make sure that I wasn't going to be so skeptical, that I wasn't open to what might be going on, which is a legitimate concern. And me checking her out like, okay, is this legitimate? Or like, who is this person? I don't know her. And, quickly, I think we kind of figured out that we could trust each other. And so, yeah, we've spent many, many hours testing and looking at Janet's brain. And she's the one that introduced me to this whole world, because I had no idea what Forever Family Foundation was at the time. And as you mentioned, she's been with them almost from the beginning. Mm-hmm. And so she's the one that introduced me and said, hey, I've got some other people I want you to meet. There's some other mediums that you might be interested in working with. And I was like, sure, why not? Again, not knowing, I had no idea what I was doing. I was just kind of going along for the ride, and it was fun and interesting. And so, yeah, here we are 12, 13 years later, and it's been kind of a fits and starts kind of a process of examining this work, but in a much broader field now.
Yeah, I think there's so much to say just in that. One being, we'll get into the details of some of your studies with the mind of a medium, which I found really fascinating with my background. Also, this scientific approach. I know there are many that want to study mediums, but it's difficult. I love that you're so open-minded, but it seems to be difficult with other people because they want the test to remain the same each time for it to be valid, which we can't really do with somebody's brain because it's a unique imprint of their own. So how would one do that? And I loved that you actually found ways in which to do this across multiple different studies, including people like yourself who with childhood was once open and then sort of learned yourself out of that, as we do in society, and then came back around, which is a really interesting story. We share some of that as well. But what I wanted to say quickly about Janet was, I know that Bob, who is the vice president and founder, shared a story with us at one of the grief retreats where she actually took that language to a South African tribe in which they speak that language. I don't know if you've heard this from her.
No.
Yeah, but it was traditional in the tribe that when the shaman would speak, or the medicine man, that the women would get up and leave. They were not allowed to be in these circles. So when she went, she began to speak in this language, and the women got up and left. And it was like, oh my gosh. And she didn't know what she was saying. And these women understood the language and understood the voice even, and got up and left. So it's sort of fascinating to me that she has no idea what she's doing. She didn't even know it was an actual language.
Yeah.
Was looking to find what that language was, and was really turned down many times and kind of called psychotic or schizophrenic. But she was relentless with trying to figure it out, and actually ultimately did, which is great. So I know that one of the more famous mediums that you study is Laura Lynn Jackson. You've also done extensive work with her. But as I was reading through your book, the mediums that you were studying, it seems like, which I found really interesting, their brainwave activity varied, which again goes back to what I was saying before. It's very difficult to study somebody who has their own unique ability. So
Yeah.
I was under the impression that when we are doing mediumship, you're in a certain state, and one being trance, which we can discuss according to your terms. I've written these down, and one just being mental mediumship, which is what most of us are doing. We're completely awake and aware, and just in what I consider an altered state. I think you have come to that realization as well, is that one must get to an altered state to be able to do this kind of work. But you have different numbers than I'm familiar with, but I'm sort of inclined to believe your numbers since you do study the brain. you are a psychologist and this is your life's work. So you speak about mediumship. I thought mediumship was about 8 to, no, 13 to 17, but you're saying it's actually more in the 8 to 12 hertz. Is that what, am I right about that?
Well, so it's complicated. So the what we generally see. So, well, let me back up one step, because you're right that there are different patterns that we've observed with different mediums. And so just to kind of like emphasize your point a little bit, that I think is really important is, if we're trying to conduct a research study the way that researchers like to do things, which is controlling all of the environmental, concerns, everybody does everything exactly the same way, for everybody. It's the same amount of time, the same questions, the same process. And, and then they combine all that data. And when you do that, you lose a lot, because if there's individual differences, it's going to get washed out. You're not going to see anything.
Right.
And so if you do that, what the results might look like is there's nothing.
Okay.
Because one person might increase theta brain waves, and one person might increase alpha brain waves, and one person might increase gamma brain waves, and they may be in different parts of the brain. And so it kind of gets, it can get washed out. Now, that being said, there are some patterns that we've seen that seem to be fairly consistent. And so certain parts of the brain show up as being involved pretty regularly. And then there's certain brain waves that seem to be most involved. And I would say that those are generally theta, which is a slower brain wave. It's between 4 and 8 hertz, and gamma, which is the fastest brain wave that we study, which, we measure somewhere around 40 hertz. So 35 to 50, let's say. So those two seem to actually be the most, show up the most with mediumship, and other psi abilities. And I think there's some reasons that makes some sense. So the frequencies that you were bringing up, kind of 8 to 12 hertz, is more alpha. So alpha is kind of right in the middle of the brainwave spectrum. And when there's an increase of alpha, the main thing that it indicates is whether your attention is internal or external.
Okay.
And so you will see alpha show up sometimes. And very often what we see when alpha does show up, it's actually a decrease of alpha, believe it or not, which is kind of a consistent pattern that you see with psychedelics as well. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is because two things are happening. The person's attention is shifting outside of themselves. So alpha is going to go down. That's one reason. And so even if your eyes are closed and it looks like you're meditating or you're in your own kind of internal space, if you're paying attention to things outside of yourself, it's still going to show up in the brain waves that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Alpha also has this organizing effect on the brain. It kind of holds everything together in a way that it's like, here's my construct of who I am as a human. And so alpha kind of like organizes the brain in various ways. And so if you decrease alpha, sometimes what it does is it opens up the possibilities of who you are, right? So you're not as controlled or contained about what it means to be, in my case, Jeff, right? That it's like, I've got an idea about, this is who I am. I'm a psychologist. You read my bio. This is who I am. I fit into this nice little box. But if you disrupt alpha, all of a sudden none of that matters. And there can be a much wider range, which is why that's the primary thing you see with psychedelics. With psychedelics, people's minds become much more open to other ways of perceiving the world, perceiving themselves, other ways of engaging. And it's not uncommon. You'll hear people report from psychedelic experiences having telepathy experiences or visitations with deceased loved ones or gods or angels or other beings. And so in my mind, rather than thinking that that's just a hallucination, right? I think it's actually real.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the mind is just now open to it. And so people can perceive it in a different way. So long answer. Hopefully I got where what you were interested in there.
Yeah, you definitely did. And I guess I'm just sort of assuming people understand what that means, but if you don't, you'll need to understand there's different states in which the brain is active and where it is, and it's delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma, and it literally is in that order, but we're doing several different things at one time. But to your point, I find this really interesting because when you have a new medium, a medium that's learning mediumship, say, and they are trying to practice in a classroom, what you'll find is when they get very self conscious or nervous because their answers aren't correct, they will start to get things more and more and more wrong, and they will go way off track. So, what you're saying, and this is also how I've been taught, is that we need to be in an altered state. Now, everyone has a different imprint in how they do that, but that altered state is you're not aware of yourself anymore and you don't really care about the outcome because you're paying attention to something greater than yourself. But the new student is so self-conscious, it's actually hard to get to that state and stay there. So most of the mediumship training, interestingly, isn't necessarily the technique and the mechanics, which is definitely there, and we need that. But it's really more about the mind and the mindset. And you speak about that as well with your martial arts training. But it's about getting yourself back into the altered state, even when you're jolted into moving into the left side of the brain, which is more logical and can be quite dominating when you're trying to do mediumship. So I think it's interesting that you're speaking about the different states in which you studied, and the mediums that are professional mediums are staying in that state essentially.
Yeah.
But the difference is some of them are in, what did you say, alpha? No, some of them are in alpha and some of them are in gamma, or everybody's in both.
Boy.
Which one is that?
Yes. So the tricky part about brain waves, right? And you were kind of alluding to this is, we have different speeds of brain waves, going from very slow delta to very fast gamma and everything in between. And the brain is making them all the time. So it's not like all of a sudden we're just making theta or we're just making gamma. We're still making the other stuff. And so what can happen is somebody can have more than one pattern at the same time. So they can have a lot of theta and a lot of gamma. So it gets a little tricky to interpret that. Like, well, what does that mean exactly? And for me, the way I've started to kind of think about this is that maybe it's less important to understand what that means precisely, right? Like, well, what does it mean when somebody has elevated theta and elevated gamma? For me, what may be more relevant is that that's a significant shift from where they were before they were doing the mediumship reading. So however they got there, they're shifting their brain out of its sort of normal processes. And so, your comment about being in some sort of an altered state, and that is, every medium I've talked to has kind of described it, and they might say, oh, it's a light altered state or something like that. But it's still, is conveying that it's not your normative consciousness. It's not where you hang out right now while we're having this conversation. It's a different space. And so I think the gift that professional mediums have is the ability to more easily shift their brainwave patterns and get out of that sort of normal way of processing. And I like the way that you talked about it, the left brain, right brain, with this kind of sticky situation, because I think about it that way as well, that because the right brain, the right hemisphere tends to be more experiential. It's
Right.
more just taking information as it comes without interpreting it and without analyzing it. And I think that's what most mediums are doing, right? When they're really on board. They're just like, and I've noticed this, right, in observing a lot of mediums, that they talk really fast a lot of times. And I suspect that that's part of the process of getting out of the way. It's like, I'm just translating what I'm getting. I'm not trying to analyze it. And even really good mediums, I've seen sometimes get off track, right? They're nailing it, they're nailing it, they're nailing it, they're nailing it. And then all of a sudden it's like, and you can almost feel it, right? There's
Yep.
like, something different. Like what happened, right? And I think what happens is that left brain gets in the way and starts to try to make sense out of it and
Yeah.
starts to go, well, maybe this is connected to that, or maybe, and so the left brain gets in the way. And now all of a sudden you're not listening anymore.
Right.
Or not as clearly. And so it's like, how do you get back over there? And again, I feel like that's what professional mediums are really good at, is being able to shift back over there, right? Catch themselves and go, okay, I'm off track. Can I get back into that space again? Whereas somebody like me or a new medium, it might be a lot harder, right? Because how do you stay in that just open space? And I mean, that's a question for you, right?
Yeah, it is. When I look at students and people that I work with, it's exactly what you're saying is what will happen is the information will come in, and when they stop and get stuck is because they are trying to figure it out. So they'll hold the information instead of letting it go and keeping going. They'll hold it, try to analyze it and figure it out. There comes the left brain, and then now they've got a cycle of no's coming, and now the ego comes in and goes, okay, let me take over. You're not doing a good job. But it is true. We have to reset and let go of all of that. And in a sense, we like to think of ourselves, or the way I've been taught, as sort of just disappearing. Like Kira needs to go away completely so that she can get something she doesn't understand and doesn't need to, because the sitter would be you giving the information to, would be the one understanding it, not me. So it's exactly what you're saying, but without you even knowing that, it's just kind of fascinating. And I know that you actually, because of who you are, and you've been trained in a very logical, scientific way, left brain dominant, in fact, that you've kind of looked at places in which you might be able to train yourself to go there and maybe stay there. And it's not just the way that I've been taught. But I find it's interesting because there still is overlapping things there, such as meditative state. So in my practice, we don't actually use meditation, but we say that meditation is always beneficial for a medium. The reason being is because it gives you something to focus on and stay there. You stay focused. You do not leave. So in one sense, it's like that focus on the communicator, let's say.
Mhm.
And then we have another type of meditation as well that's different. But you have studied quite a bit in the world of meditation. So what's your take on, you've done a lot of studies on this with yourself and others, not just mediums. So what do you think about the idea of just doing meditation as an altered state?
Yeah, my current feeling is that meditation can be a really helpful process for opening up to some of these abilities. And I say it that way because my opinion is that everybody has these abilities, whether they can access them consistently or effectively is another issue. But
Yeah.
I think we all have these abilities. And I think meditation is kind of training. And it's training in a few different ways. And one way of training is it's training the brain, training the mind to be more flexible on one hand. So kind of like we said, can we train the mind to get to a space where I'm not thinking about myself,
Yeah.
which is
Right.
what we do all day long, and we don't even know we're doing it. It's so automatic. In fact, the part of the brain, the network in the brain that's responsible for that is appropriately called the default mode network. Literally, it's our default mode to think about ourselves. And
Interesting.
so if we're not doing something else, we're thinking about ourselves. And so it's the brain's natural tendency. And so practicing, well, how do I shift into a space where I'm not thinking about myself? Right? I think that can be really useful by just period. And it's helpful for mental health, right? Which, you know,
Yeah.
the Buddhists have known this forever, right? That,
Yes. Absolutely.
you
Yeah.
know, suffering is caused by the mind by
Mm-hmm.
basically thinking about ourselves. So if you can stop doing that, you're going to feel better. But so, we've identified a few different styles of meditation based on how they affect the brain. And so honestly, I feel like all of them can be useful for opening up to psi abilities. The one that I'm most interested in at the moment in this regard is more of kind of a mindfulness practice, which, and I want to define that just because mindfulness is now kind of being used to mean everything. Mindfulness has been kind of this umbrella term that means anything related to meditation or even just relaxation. But I'm using it in a really specific way of, in some ways, it's exactly what we just described. Paying attention to what's happening internally and externally, but without judgment, without attaching to it, without creating a story about it, without a narrative.
Yeah.
It's almost just like pure sense awareness. And so I feel, and it's very right-brained. If you look at what happens in the brain with those types of practices, it's all right-brained activation and you're quieting down the left hemisphere.
So you're saying that mindfulness meditation allows you to think internally and externally, which I love because it gives you a multi-dimensional versus it's all about me focus. Is that right?
Right. So, it's interesting because sometimes with mindfulness practices, people will choose one or the other, right? So it's like, well, I'm paying attention to what's happening internally. So
Okay.
I'm noticing my thoughts. I'm noticing my feelings. I'm noticing my bodily sensations, but without attaching to it. Or you'll see people, oh, I'm noticing the color of the leaves and the feel of the breeze on my skin and the sounds of the bird. But again, without kind of attaching a label to anything, you're just noticing the sensory impressions of that. So, but you can practice it in a way where you're doing both, where you're just being open. And it's like, well, what's showing up? What's showing up in my field of consciousness? Like, oh, I'm aware that my back's a little bit uncomfortable. Oh,
Right.
interesting. Can I be aware of that and then let that go? Oh, now I'm aware of the sound of the air conditioner. Oh, let that go. Can it just be sound? Can it not be interpreted? Oh, the sound of the air conditioner. It's just a sound, right?
Okay.
Like I don't have to identify what it is. And even the pain in my back, I don't have to identify that that's pain. Can I just experience the sensation and that's enough? It doesn't have to become something. Because as soon as I identify, oh, that's pain, I've interpreted it. My left brain has gotten involved. It said, oh, that thing in my back, that's pain. And then it wants to make up a story. Oh, it's probably from working too hard yesterday. Oh, I should have taken my time when I was lifting weights. Next time I go, I better do this. So now you've turned it into a story instead of, oh, there's a sensation. Okay. That's it. And so can we learn to pay attention that way?
Yeah.
Which is kind of training the left hemisphere that it doesn't always have to get engaged, that it's okay to just experience things without having to put a label on it, get attached to it, push things away that we don't like. It doesn't matter. Just let it all come in and just let it happen and be aware of it, which is the tricky part, right? Because it's all coming in,
Yeah.
but can we also be aware of it?
So that's really fascinating because that actually does exactly what I was talking about with the new mediums is they get attached to it, they have a story about it. But if we can learn how to just observe and let go, that's a very different approach where we would definitely not get involved and definitely not get as stressed because one thing that happens with a new medium and a new meditator is there's a stress element where they're attached and it's like this ongoing thought of I'm not doing it, I'm supposed to be doing it, I'm not relaxed, how come I can't relax? This isn't for me, and everyone gives up. But what they miss, and this is mediumship too, is that you have to practice this. This is a training for your brain. This isn't just here we go, now you're a medium, let's go out and deal with the public. This is really intense training. And with that, I'd like to move into the psychic ability. Your studies show that that actually is a different brain function, which would make sense to me because it feels very different when you're doing it as a psychic medium. So, what were your observations with that? I know just for the rest of you, he does go into this in the book extensively. So if you're interested, I would recommend you read through. He has pictures and all kinds of really cool things in there. But what's your takeaway observation with studying mostly Laura Lynn and a few others with the difference between mediumship and psychic abilities?
Yeah. I'd say the biggest difference is in the occipital lobes. So this is the very back part of the brain. It's all the way at the back of the head. And one of the main functions of the occipital lobes is visual processing. Now, it does other stuff as well. We like to simplify the brain and we say, this part does this and this part does that.
Right.
Like, yeah, and it's a little more complicated. And the occipital lobe at the very back of the brain, its primary job is processing visual information. And interestingly, when folks are doing psychic readings or psychic work, that is the part of the brain that seems to light up. And it lights up usually with gamma, so that fastest brainwave. So it's almost like there's a increased perception that's happening at this very high level. So I personally, I find it interesting that it's the fastest frequency, because people use terms like, tapping into a higher vibration or, things like that.
Yeah.
And literally that's what the brain is doing. It's tapping into the highest vibration that it can tap into. And even though it's in the visual processing area, not everybody picks up information visually. Some people might get information auditorily or just feeling it, all the different clairs. And it still seems to show up in the occipital lobes. And so again, for me, it suggests that the occipital lobes are probably involved in other kinds of sensory processing as well. And I think of it the same, again, using language. We talk about, we use the phrase seeing something a lot, even if we're not seeing it. It's like, even if we perceive something, we say, oh, I saw. And it's like, well, did you see it or did you hear it? And it's like, but we use them almost interchangeably, and people use them interchangeably with this work a lot. So they'll just use that term, I saw something. And I think actually the occipital lobes processes some of that information the same way, that it doesn't necessarily matter what the sense is. So that's the biggest difference. Now, sometimes the occipital lobes will show up and do some interesting things during mediumship, but a lot of times they'll actually shut down. So there'll be more slow brain waves hanging out in the occipital lobes during a mediumship reading. Whereas with psychic stuff, it's almost always gamma. There can be other stuff going on, but it shows up a lot. And, so for me, one of the things that I suspect, can't prove this, but is that gamma in the back of the head is really linked to the third eye. And that when we're activating and accessing third eye perception, that it's still getting processed in the visual cortex, that it is a way of seeing. It's just a higher way of seeing, but it has to get processed in the brain somewhere in order for us to be able to understand what the heck is going on from a human perspective. So it's almost like there's these vibrations out there that we have to somehow bring into this little human body and make sense out of. So it's like a transducer almost. And so we've got this vibration that comes in through the third eye, and then the brain has to interpret it so that it turns into something that we can understand from a human perspective. And so that's my theory, is that's, the third eye information gets funneled largely to the occipital lobes.
That is really interesting. So you do subscribe, because I know I've read the book too, to the third eye concept, which would also go in line with the chakras. So now from a scientist's approach, they would say that's absolutely ridiculous. There's no such thing. But in some ways, you're saying it's how your brain is processing it is the third eye sensory. Is that correct? Or do you really believe that there's sensory points, let's, for lack of a better word, in our body, otherwise known as energy systems, which are chakras? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, personally, so this is, personal and scientific. Personally, I absolutely think there are various types of energetic systems that are in and around the body, and, chakras and meridians and biofields and auras and whatever we want to call all of those things. I think they all exist. And some of them we can sort of measure with scientific equipment. It's almost like we can't measure it directly. We have to come up with something that's it's related, right? So, I can measure changes in electrical activity on the skin around the chakra areas.
Okay.
Is that the chakra itself? Probably not. But when the chakra becomes activated, does it also affect the electrical systems in the body? Probably, right? So it's kind of this funny process where we don't really have a way at this point to measure these things directly. However, people experience them and they know them, and we have these physical corollaries, right, that kind of go with them. And then there's just simply the subjective experience. And I've had some of these myself of what it feels like when the third eye is open, or the heart center is open, or the crown's open, whatever. People have these experiences, and it's really hard to deny when you've experienced them. And so more and more, I feel like in science, we ignore people's experiences if we can't prove it. And I'm starting to move away from that and feeling like, well, wait a minute. Isn't the human experience, isn't that the primary thing that we're dealing with here? Isn't that the most important thing of what people experience? And just because the science hasn't got there yet doesn't mean it's not real. So I think the third eye, the Ajna chakra, I think it is a real thing. But it has to, the information that goes in there and is processed, it still has to get sort of translated down. It has to get brought down into the physical form. And so I think that's where the brain comes in, and that's where the occipital lobes come in, is that it's a way to translate that information in a way that we can understand it or do something with it, because it's a different vibration.
Are you familiar with Heart Math? Heart Math Institute. So they've done a lot of studies with the heart coherence, mainly, obviously, the name. But I know a lot of that is studied with them as best they can. But I know they've also done a lot of work with Dr. Joe Dispenza. You're familiar with him, I'm sure, who does work similar to what you're speaking about as well. But what I found interesting was that they were saying that when we have heart coherence, when they were looking at healers, which you have as well, that in fact, when we have a coherence there, we don't need to be even labeled a healer. Everyone is a healer because we all inherently have this ability, which you also spoke about earlier. So, but what their point is that once we have this coherence, we open up this ability for deep healing among ourselves and even extended to others. I also found it interesting that when they did studies on it with just normal, average, everyday people, they ended up having a greater result within the healing aspect than the people that labeled themselves healers. Which is a whole nother place we could go. But it may be due to maybe the stress that the healer has of the label that they want to uphold. Who knows what it is. But I think it shows something that is even maybe written in the Bible about how we are actually all healers, truly great healers, and also manifestors, which gets me into this idea of the mind and the mindset. You spoke about something in your book that somebody had shared with you, which is with Tai Chi, or I think it was Tai Chi master. And he said he teaches energy, mindset, and empathy, which is actually also mediumship as well. So it's just kind of fascinating that this is just going across all different lines here.
Yeah.
But so energy, we've spoken about, we were just speaking about the coherence, the magnetic frequencies, the brain, but the mindset we've also touched on as well, haven't we, in terms of moving us out of these states and needing to have discipline to stay in the state is what I call it. I don't know what you think of that mindset aspect of it. And then also we have empathy, which we haven't touched on yet. What are your thoughts on the studies that you've done, the experiences, which are many that you've had? What do you think about that piece of it?
Yeah, there's a lot in there, right? The first thing that jumps out, because like, well, which part do we want to talk about, right? There's so many pieces
No.
in there.
Yeah.
The So it's for me, it's very interesting. So I want to kind of circle back for a second and tie it in uh, to your question. The idea that sometimes people that have no training, have no idea what they're doing, are the most effective.
Yes.
And I think it actually ties to this idea of mindset and empathy. It's sort of beginner's mind, another meditation concept.
Yeah.
Um, can you approach things as if you're a beginner, as if you know nothing? And it's interesting because I just finished a year-long biodynamic craniosacral therapy training, and which is an energy healing. It's really energy healing. And uh, one of the things that I noticed, I'm just wrapping up that training, and when I'm the most effective is when I can get into that beginner's mind state. It was really funny. The last training we had, so it's a series of these 4-day intensives, and like the last one, I was like, what happened? Like I used to think I was pretty good at this, and like I feel like I suck. I feel like I'm terrible. I'm like, what happened? Yeah, I was like, this is weird. Like I felt like I was a natural at this, and then it finally hit me, and it was like, oh my gosh, like I know too much. I'm trying too hard. I'm trying to understand what's going on in a different way. Whereas beginners, they don't know what they're doing. They just show up and it's like, here, just put your hands here. And it's like, okay. And that works, right? It's like we overcomplicate things, and the mind overcomplicates things. And so that simplicity, I think, is really powerful. And it's a lesson that is so hard to learn. Another example, I've been doing some research recently with random event generators. And, so it's kicking out ones and zeros thousands of times a second. And the idea is, can we mentally influence the outcome of how many ones and zeros are getting spit out by this computer program? And this has been researched a lot. But I've been playing with it. I'm working on a couple of projects right now using these. And it's very interesting because it almost seems to have a stronger influence, people do, on this computer, the less they try.
Yeah.
Like if you're aware of it, but then you almost don't even pay attention, it seems to do better than if you're like, I'm going to make more ones. And it's like, doesn't work. It doesn't work. And so like I've been running a bunch of control trials where there's nobody here. I'm just sitting here by myself, and I run it, and then I'm just doing something else while it's running, so that I'm not trying to influence it. I'm like playing with Facebook, or I'm messing with something, or answering an email, and I just let it run. And I'm getting more successful trials by doing that than when I try. And it's like, because part of my brain is aware of this. It's aware that it's running. It knows it's there. So I've got some sort of connection to it, empathy, but I'm not trying to force it. I'm not trying to force anything to happen. So I think mindset is important. This idea of kind of beginner's mind, not trying too hard. But then empathy, and the way that empathy was used by, the people that I talked to in the book, they're really talking about forming a connection.
Right.
And so in this case, I'm talking about this computer program. I was like, well, how do you form a connection with the computer program? I was like, well, we form connections with everything. If you pay attention to something, you have a connection to it. And again, this may be energetic, but there's something that happens. And so again, it's like, can I form some sort of a connection with whatever it is? If it's a person, if I'm trying to do a telepathy or a psychic reading, can I have a connection with this person? If it's a spirit, can I have a connection with that? If it's this computer program. But so it can't just be this objective, separated thing. I'm over here, you're over there. Like somehow we have to reach a feeling that we are connected. And I think this gets into sort of a big universal truth, right? That everything is connected, ultimately. We're not separate. That's just that's a brain thing. The brain makes us think we're separate. And we're not. And so if we can move beyond that, well then of course we can influence each other, and we can read each other, and we can read energy, and we can influence the computer, because everything is connected. It's all energy. It's all connected. So I think that's really what the core of empathy is. But again, how do you do that? Because I don't think it's something we can think our way into. We have to feel it. We have to feel the connection. But again, we can't try too hard.
No, we can't. And that's the most frustrating thing about this stuff, isn't it? So it's like train yourself to be really good at detaching in a way, right? Like which would be psychotic in some places. But I think that's really interesting that you're speaking about the more attention that you pay, the less you get out of this computer of all things. But it's the same thing with psychic development and mediumship. The more attention your mind pays, the less you're going to get that's accurate. And they even say that in law of attraction, don't they? Just think about it and let it go. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of speaking about letting things go because that's when the creation and the manifestation can happen.
Yeah.
So I think that's really, really interesting. You also talked about some different ways in which you've done things. Many ways were trying to actually alter and influence the brain. So you've done this through so many different things. You've done it through psychedelics. You've done it through like sound waves, binaural beat kind of things, technology, bands that you put on. So they're influencing the waves of the brain. There are just many different studies that you've done. And it seems to me all of these studies were effective, essentially, but really effective in getting your left brain out of the way, your logic to move to the side.
Yeah.
So what are your takeaways on that? Do you think these things are necessary, or maybe they're more necessary for certain people? What do you think of that?
Yeah. I don't think they're necessary. I think of them as power tools. You don't have to have a circular saw to build a deck. You can use a handsaw,
Yeah.
but it's a little easier, if you. So, I think of some of these technology tools as just that. They're tools, and they can be helpful for certain people, because what it's really doing is it's nudging your brain one way or another out of its normal way of functioning. I mean, that's the upshot of what the technology is doing, whether it's audio-visual entrainment or pulsed electromagnetic frequencies or whatever.
Yeah.
You're essentially knocking the brain out of its normal way of processing information. And so when people are able to find the right frequency or the right protocol that really works for them, then it's kind of like it gets you halfway there. It's
Okay.
already kind of like, now you still have to learn how to pay attention. And this is the thing I bring up a lot with people, is that the technology isn't going to make you psychic. Again, you're already psychic. That's not the problem. The problem is accessing that information. And so again, the technology can kind of help, but you still have to learn how to do it. It's the same with meditation. We use a lot of technology with meditation. And it's not going to make you a meditator. It's not going to make you an expert meditator, even though sometimes people claim this.
Yeah.
But what it does is it can help move the brain into a space where it's going to be easier to get into a meditative state. You still have to learn how to meditate. You still have to do the work.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I've observed with using the technology with now quite a few people is that people that are already pretty tapped in, who they've been practicing psychic skills or mediumship, they may not be professionals, but they've been working on developing these skills. They find the technology to be super helpful because it just kind of like launches them there.
Yeah.
Whereas people that maybe haven't really opened up at all, haven't figured out how to do this, so kind of at ground zero, it's less helpful. And I think it's the point that I've been kind of making. It's like, well, the technology isn't going to just all of a sudden make you able to tap in. You kind of have to know how to tap in, and then this can kind of, be a supercharge to kind of get you there. Now, none of these things I'm saying are 100% true because everybody's a little different, but it is a trend that's fairly strong.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. I would have thought the opposite, actually. I would have thought that if you hadn't tapped in, it would help you relax enough to tap in, because a new person in this work, actually meditation as well, is you really have to learn how to relax and move your mind. That's the number one thing. No matter how you get there, that is the essential thing you must do. So I would have thought that it would have helped you, but I can see how if you just think this thing is going to magically change things, now your mind is set in a certain way that actually wouldn't have much of an effect or help you much.
Right. And yeah, and just to sort of, there may be some sort of like a bell curve or something with this too, because so like on the one end, like the people who really aren't, they really aren't tapped in at all, right, to any of their psychic abilities or their mediumship abilities. Yeah, the technology probably isn't going to do that much. It might, but it's going to have a smaller impact. The people who seem to have the strongest effect are the ones who, and this is kind of most of the people that sign up for these classes and things, right? Because they've already got some ability, they've had some interesting experiences, stuff happens maybe they're just really intuitive, or there's a lot of synchronicities in their life, or they have precognitive dreams or whatever, something that is already awake in the field. So they seem to do really well with the technology. Then on the other end of the continuum, perhaps people like yourself who are professionals, they do this, right? Like all the time. They actually don't really, a lot of times, not always, but they often don't really like the technology. It's almost too much. It's like they're already there. And it's like, I don't need anything else. Now, I say that's not always true, because I do have a good friend who's a medium up in Massachusetts, and she loves this stuff. Like, she loves the technology. She uses it all the time, even though she can tap in without it, and she's a professional and she does this all the time. So it's not like it's 100%, but I've also seen several of my mediumship friends who are very skilled, and I try some of this with them and they're like, I don't like it.
It's so funny. I think it's because we're already trained. We've trained so much to do a certain thing, and then it kind of alters because we're sensitive. So we feel the alter. And
Yeah.
it's like, I don't know how to work with this. That's really interesting. So with your study, I know you do teach people. You teach people meditation, obviously, all the time, because that's your business. But you also have started kind of teaching people about this psychic skills and how
Yeah.
to open up to their own psychic skills. In these classes, what are your observations in terms of the just different dynamics of people coming in? And do you find that you must, or that you have to kind of try many different things because not everyone is going to get it? And yes, okay, I was thinking so. And in doing that, is it just a matter of trying a lot of different altered states, if you will?
Mhm. So yeah, the classes that we've been teaching, we're using one specific type of technology. It's an audio-visual entrainment technology. So there's lights in these specially made glasses that flicker at a certain frequency, and it essentially pulls the brain to that frequency. So if we're trying to create more theta, the lights might flicker on and off 6 times a second, which then the brain starts matching that. So that's the entrainment part.
Okay.
And 6 cycles per second, 6 hertz, that's theta. So we can kind of use this to pull the brain toward whatever the desired frequency is that we want it to go to. And so the way that the classes have evolved is that each week we work with a different protocol. So one week it's theta, one week it's gamma, one week we do a Gansfeld thing, which actually isn't stimulation at all, but it's just a field effect. One week we do a left-right brain differentiation. So we're sending slow frequencies to the left hemisphere and fast frequencies to the right hemisphere.
Interesting.
Yeah, because you can split the fields, the visual fields. And so each week we do something a little different. And then they practice in between sessions with the glasses and the technology. And of course, there's a lot of other options available that they can experiment with on their own. And so what's really interesting is there are certain protocols that almost everybody likes. So that left-right brain thing, almost everybody likes that one and feels like it's helpful, to tap in. But when you get to like the theta or the gamma, it's really funny because a third of the people will love it, whichever one, pick one. They're like, oh my God, this is so great. This is amazing. And the other 2/3 are kind of like, I don't know. And so we do have to experiment. We have to try. So for me, what I've kind of set this up to do, because I can't measure everybody's brains in advance, I don't know what their brains are doing. So we have to try things. So we explain each one, why it might be important or relevant. We try it. And then that subjective experience. Well, what happened for you? And, the people are like, I wasn't feeling that one. It's like, okay, great. Put it on the shelf. Let's keep going. And so then by the end of the 4 weeks, although we've been extending it to 6 weeks because there's always more to do. But by the end of it, I don't think there's been a case so far. I should knock on wood, right? But where somebody hasn't found at least one protocol that doesn't really work for them. So really it is kind of a little bit of a trial and error process, but we can be smart about it because, we know certain things that are likely to work. But your brain's different than my brain. So, we have to be a little flexible with it.
Yeah. And that goes to everyone out there who's trying to do psychic work or learning mediumship. We have to remember that everybody's different. There is no one protocol that you don't need to give up if it's not effective yet. You do need to keep exploring and trying. And that is also written in your book. I'm curious about this, going back to the states of the brain. Have you done studies, or maybe I missed it, with the difference between mental mediumship, trance mediumship, and you probably haven't studied physical mediumship, but those are very clear altered states that are deeper. So mental is actually quite active, obviously, because I could sit here and talk to you. But then we've got trance, where supposedly it is said that you shouldn't be moving, although we see a lot of people that are in trance moving. So who's to say whether they're in trance or not? I don't know. But then we've got physical mediumship, whereas the person is not actually available, but phenomena is happening. Have you studied that? Have you thought about that? What are your thoughts of that?
I have not studied physical mediumship. That would be interesting. That would be fun. My sense, I don't personally know any physical mediums, but the sense that I've got from talking with various folks is that they often seem to be pretty sensitive about their environment when they're doing their work.
Yeah.
And so having an EEG cap on your head and wires and computers and, it's going to make it tricky, I think, to get that kind of data, that kind of good data. Trance mediumship, I have worked with a couple of trance mediums, and the level of trance that they're in varies. I would say it's more than what I've seen with mental mediumship.
Right.
Yeah, but it seems to vary. And so, unfortunately, because I've really only got data on a couple of people with trance work, I don't know that I can say a whole lot yet because I just don't have a very big sample. But you're right. It does look a little bit different. In one case in particular, kind of all of the brain waves dropped out. And, to me, that almost feels like a non-dual state. Like if we want to think about it in terms of meditation, a state where you're gone, right? Like you're not here anymore, as a human. So your brain just kind of like everything drops out. Now something is still happening, obviously, but, experienced meditators in different traditions can get into states like that where everything just disappears. And so I have seen that a few times, but I've seen other patterns too, where like there's an increase of slow brain waves, which can also work because if there's an increase of like delta and theta, essentially what that means is that those areas of the brain are shut down, right? Because it's really slow activity. So we think of like delta as being involved in like deep sleep, right? And so your conscious mind isn't involved anymore, right? It's like, you're somewhere else. And so you'll see that happen sometimes with trance mediumship as well, that those really slow brain waves. But like I said, I need to study this a bit more, but there do seem to be at least a couple of different patterns that can show up.
Yeah, I would think so because in my experience, true trance is that deep sleep state where you're not really able to move much. And physical mediumship is a drop below that. So you're truly not there. So you would need somebody to actually sit and record you because you wouldn't be capable of noting anything. And I think that trance is like that as well. I have experience with meditations that I've done on kind of these retreats where we were led into a meditation that was 4 hours, and by the time the meditation was over, he said, "Okay, this is the time," and nobody knew that it had been 4 hours, and the whole room went, and it was like this crazy experience where we were nowhere. I don't know where we were for that long. It really didn't feel it felt like our normal thing. We had been meditating for a week, but we just all slipped into this really altered state, which obviously is a trance-like state to be somewhere for so long and feel that it's timeless.
Yeah.
Have you studied anything like that? I'm sure you've experienced it, or do you know what it is I'm speaking of?
I mean, I know what you're speaking of. I can't say that I've personally ever done a single meditation for 4 hours. I-
It was
uh,
unique.
yeah, yeah. You know, I can speculate about what might be going on, but I don't know for sure. Um, but certainly when we get into a space that feels timeless,
Yeah.
again, it starts to suggest kind of that non-dual kind of a state because, timing and being aware of time, that's a very basic function in the brain. It's, we have a joke in my family. My wife actually made me a t-shirt that says Time Lord. And just because I'm so aware of time, always but it's like, I don't have to try. It's just the brain is aware of these things, right? And so if you get into a state where that's just not happening, then it has to be a really deep, if we want to call it a deep state, a really deep state of consciousness where some really primitive and basic functions of the brain are offline. They're not doing their normal job. So again, I would suspect it kind of looks like that. Everything's kind of shut down, kind of a mode, which is a nice place to be.
Yeah, it was a great place to be. I mean, no pain, no thought, no time, no
Right.
consciousness, just bliss, really, in a
Yeah.
way. You reach a certain state, which is, in my opinion, pretty hard to get to,
Yeah. Yeah.
for the average person. So, for someone who is having a difficult time with this, because I hear a lot of people say, I'm just ADHD, or I'm very logical, or I'm very left brain, or dominant there. What do you say to, I mean, we obviously all have this ability, and I don't believe that somebody cannot learn how to access it. So, what do you say to people like that?
Yeah. I mean, really there's a couple of things that I think are important. So if somebody really wants to develop their abilities to tune into this stuff, I think two things have to happen, at least two things, right? So one is somehow shifting your brain because again, this is coming from my perspective, right? That's what I do is I look at the brain and I can understand that the nervous system in the brain, it inhibits it inhibits ourselves. It limits information. That's a primary function of the brain is to limit information.
Mm.
So if you can't shift out of that state, good luck, right? It's going to be really difficult to really tap into these abilities. So whether it's through meditation or whether it's through using technology or whatever, somehow learning how to get out of your stuck, kind of rigid, and I don't mean this in a negative way, it's what the brain does. It likes habits. It likes things to be the same and to be predictable. And so,
Yeah.
so we have to break that up somehow. But then the other thing is the practicing, right? And that's, like you have to use these abilities. You have to learn to pay attention. And, and this is something that for me is personally has always been really interesting is I love all this stuff now. And, I did when I was a kid. And I've always wanted to be able to do some of this stuff. And so what'll happen is I'll practice. I'll pick a thing. whatever it is. And I'll practice and I'll practice and I'll practice. And I'll start getting pretty good at it and I'll start getting results, whatever it is, doesn't matter. And then at the point that I start getting decent at it, I'm kind of like, okay, I did it. And I'm kind of done, right? But it's like, and then I move on to something else. But for me, what that really emphasizes is that it does take practice. It does take devotion, at least at the beginning, right? To learn, like, how do I tap into this and how do I pay attention and how do I access this and how do I stay in these states of consciousness that, you were describing. And so, I feel like both are important. And, and so whether that's, taking classes with, like with yourself or other mediums who teach classes on this, or, there's lots of ways you can practice by yourself,
Yeah.
and, but you have to do it. And so again, this is, picking on myself again. I feel like spirit communication is not my strongest suit. And, there's other things that I'm better at. And it's funny because I think about it. It's like, well, you know what? Like, I never actually ask questions or, like, I just assume it's like, well, okay, I'm here, talk to me. Oh, there's nobody talking to me. Okay, well, all right, I guess. And it never occurred to me. I mean, now I've had several mediums tell me, it's like, well, dude, you got to like start the conversation, like,
right.
Reach out.
Yeah.
It's like, oh,
it's a communication.
Yeah. Oh, it's a two-way thing. Oh, weird. Okay. And so it just never occurred to me, right? And so I think it's an example, right? Like if you don't know what you're doing and you have assumptions for whatever reason, you may never connect. And it's not because you can't, it's because you're approaching it the wrong way. And so, learning from somebody who knows what they're doing, who can provide guidance, I think is super useful.
Yeah. You reminded me of something that my mentor said once, which was, if you go to somebody's house and ring the doorbell and they open it and you say nothing, that would be kind of weird, wouldn't it? So we have to think of it as they open the door and you're like, hey, my name's Jeff. I wanted to know if whatever. And then that person would respond versus just ringing the doorbell and standing there and like, nope, don't hear anything. Better wrap it up and get out, which is amazing. I know there's so much more to go over, but I don't want to take too much of your time. But I do want to direct people back to you. So obviously the book has so much information. We just barely got into it, so much of this. You have your own website, which is, what is that?
There's a couple of them. For the psychic stuff, it's www.psychicmindscience.com. And then for the meditation work, it's www.neuromeditationinstitute.com.
And we'll link all of this in the comments, but I know you also have social media that people can follow you on as well. And do you have your own YouTube channel?
Yep. There's so Psychic Mind Science and Neuro Meditation Institute both have YouTube channels, both have Facebook pages, both have Instagram pages. So yeah, you can find us in most of the, no TikTok. I don't have a TikTok or an X account, but the basic ones we have.
Okay. Well, I will link all of that in the show notes, but I want to definitely advise everyone to do that because, again, we've only brushed on some of the things that he's gotten into. There's so much more to this man. So thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Tarrant. I so appreciate you taking the time to be with me and the people that follow me. So thank you.
Oh, of course. Thanks for having me. And one of these days we'll have to map your brain.
I would love that. That would be amazing. Let's do it.
Okay.
Thank you again.
Thanks.